So, what sort of world can we expect? And what is this going to mean for Europe and its future? And the starting point obviously has to be with the fact that we're in the middle of enormous changes. And we don't really know how this is all going to end up. But a lot of the things we took for granted about the past don't seem to be true anymore. And let me just consider some aspects of this. Perhaps the first and most important is, for the first time, certainly since the fall of the Soviet Union, and I would argue since long before then, the West has a genuine peer competitor in a new superpower, China, whose economy on some measures is as big as that of the US. Despite its recent difficulties, it's faster growing than the Western economies. It has an enormous population, even though declining, and it has a close alliance with Russia, which is a immensely well-armed nuclear power, which is at war with us. The transformation of the world system that is a result of that is very profound. It affects our economy, our politics, the way we run our society, and of course our ability to manage the global commons, the issues that we're all worried about. Because while China is clearly a peer competitor, it's also a country that we clearly have to do business with, we have to deal with, whose economy is important for us. And this is a geopolitical switch, transformation, which we're beginning to grapple with. And the Americans are very clearly taking the lead in a very traditionally American way in viewing China as a rival and competitor first and foremost. And for Europe, I think it's fair to say we're not clear what this is going to mean and how to deal with it, but it's very clear that it's a huge transformation of our system. The second big thing that has been happening is a series of vast economic shocks. One of them is globalization itself, the legacy of which has been to transform our economies in many ways. It is one of the factors behind deindustrialization, the other being, of course, the very rapid productivity growth in manufacturing. And that's changed not only our economy, but our social structure. In particular, it has created very considerable insecurity in the old industrial working class and in the parts of our countries in which they lived. That has also had a very powerful domestic political consequence. I think that's true in every Western country, in that it is part of the reason, this economic transformation, along with the transformation of our population through immigration, that has made a lot of people feel very anxious. Then along came another huge economic shock or transformation. The former one, deindustrialization, the impact of trade, was long running over many decades. But then came the financial crisis. And the financial crisis was a watershed moment, in my view, in that it revealed very clearly that the people responsible for core institutions in our society, our banks, our financial institutions, our economic stability, didn't really know what they were doing. And they, even worse, the people who had been responsible for these problems were rescued at the expense of the state when lots of ordinary people weren't. And then after that, pretty well everywhere, there was fiscal austerity, public spending was reduced, and our economies mostly never really recovered. We've had a very long and difficult period. Germany, perhaps a few other countries have succeeded, but many other countries really never got back to the preceding rate of growth. So this combination has, in my view, been these things coming together, the reason we see this upsurge of populism and nationalism in politics, very clearly in the US and UK, but I would suggest also very strongly in other countries, this dismissal, as it were, of the old elites, of the old political elites and the political establishments, and in some cases, pretty well the dissolution of political parties as effective instruments of politics. And the most striking example of that, I think, in the West is what's been happening in France. So we have had this huge power change and a series of big economic changes. Now, if we look ahead at technology, we can expect economic changes with consequent further influence on our politics, if anything, to get bigger. It's clear we are now in an enormous transformation of our technology. This was already happening through information and communications technology, the rise of the new media, the rise of the huge tech companies, mostly American, very significant fact for Europe, had already had a profound effect on our societies. But now, we're now moving into the age of artificial intelligence. And artificial intelligence, it is now beginning to be quite clear, is going to transform not just the work of the people already affected, or what I call the industrial working class, perhaps quite a number of others, but really people doing all sorts of jobs in our society are going to find they're going to be transformed by the impact of artificial intelligence, which is also, of course, enabling China, along with what it's doing already, to create a new sort of society, a full surveillance society of its ability to survey the activities of everybody in their population. But we're seeing, people would argue, the combination of big tech, perhaps particularly with these new technologies, to do the same sort of thing through private business, so that nobody really actually has a private sphere anymore. So it's not only an economic transformation, it's also very, very clearly a social, and one might argue also potentially a political transformation. And these technological transformations are at really, I think, only in their infancy. We don't know where that is going to end us up. Now, all this is happening within slowing growth and so forth, within a context in which we are very concerned, increasingly concerned, about the fate of the global commons. Climate is the big issue here, but it's the biosphere more broadly. There's a sense that our economies are operating in ways that are completely inconsistent with the planetary limits, the limits on our activities. Now, this is obviously true. It doesn't seem that we have very much time before we are going to move into a fundamentally destabilized climate with increases in temperatures of more than 1.5 degrees centigrade from pre-industrial levels and continuing upwards. The problem with this challenge is that it's truly global. The developed countries produce less than half the emissions, so they produce most of the historic emissions, and now they have to make a deal with the whole emerging and developing world. It's not going to do much if Europe were to eliminate its emissions. That's only about 10% of the world's total, and it's not really growing. So we have to cooperate intensely with the rest of the world, and we have to find a way to get the most modern technologies of renewables developed and used across the entire world. Our financial system, our international financial institutions are completely incapable of achieving this. While we focus very much on what we're doing inside Europe, inside the developed countries, that's really not where this climate problem is going to be resolved. Now, if this were not bad enough, we also have to recognize there are some very big ongoing problems within the old high-income countries, many of which I've mentioned, but let me just stress two others which are very closely linked. The first of these, perhaps the biggest force of all in the long run, is demography. Our populations in Europe, very much so, are aging. We have an ever-increasing proportion of old people, and this is happening at a time when, as I've already mentioned, the underlying dynamic of productivity growth, despite these technology changes, at least so far, seems to be rather weak. So our economies are growing relatively slowly. our population is aging, and what this means is government revenue is generally growing rather slowly, while the demands among government, the demands for spending, particularly in the European welfare states, are going to increase very, very powerfully. It's just ineluctable, which will mean almost inevitably the tendency towards rising tax burdens in an economy where growth is weak, which means that for the people who are paying most of these taxes, the younger population, the middle-aged population, the burden will be rising. And many of them will feel this is not for them, this is for their parents and grandparents, whom they may love, but they may also feel that the generation of their parents and grandparents didn't plan for all this properly. They didn't take care of this. And in addition, they allowed the climate problem to become insoluble. So there is generational tension associated with this. Now, an obvious way, and many people discuss this, to solve this aging problem of our societies is to accept large-scale immigration. But that's become politically almost inconceivable in our societies. Nevertheless, it is a safe bet that demographic pressure, immigration pressure from the rest of the world will rise for Europe, and particularly for Europe. More than half on UN projections of the increase in population in the world over the next 20, 30 years will come in sub-Saharan Africa. If the development of this continent is not improved, if its dynamism is not improved, it's pretty predictable what's going to happen in terms of immigration pressure. So demography has a two-sided effect. It's a problem for us, but the obvious solution is one we don't really like, but it's going to, or many political forces don't like, but are likely to become more serious. And the final point, which is really about politics, is, well, do we have the capacity politically to resolve these problems? Can we respond to them effectively? That's the great challenge for the future. And we have to understand two things about where our politics are, and they're linked to what I've said. Well, three things perhaps. First, there's this growing populist pressure, which reflects the fact that a big part of our population no longer trusts mainstream politics and politicians, including the experts that advise them. The second big problem is that states, all the states, are struggling with pressures, perfectly legitimate pressures to spend, to support their populations, at a time when their underlying revenues, as I've mentioned, aren't growing, and where the economies aren't growing, and that means that they're reaching the limits of what they can do. Remember, our states are already, particularly in Europe, the highest spending states in the world. That makes it very difficult for them to do this, to do what they did in the middle of the 20th century, creating the new welfare states at a time, high growth and youthful populations. That can't be done again. How they're going to resolve those problems are not clear. And then the final aspect of this is that so many of these problems, the problems of climate change, of managing globalization, all these problems, the challenges of developing a new set of industrial policies which will revitalize our economies, are just so difficult, and many of them will require international cooperation. And a final perfect example of that is the big debate we're having right now over the American Inflation Reduction Act, which is essentially a huge industrial subsidy program. How can we cooperate with the Americans in this rather than fragmenting the world economy further? And the same problem arises in our need to cooperate with China over the other great global challenges. So these are, I think, very challenging times, very exceptional times of transition and change, and our politicians and our politics have to rise to meet them.